Today we're going to be talking about the Cold War from 1945 to 1980. And just as a quick introduction, we wanted to let you know that colleges wanted to make sure that we finished the course. So that's why we're covering the remainder of the course, both period 8 and both period 9. But we're going to focus on skills, and those skills will be things that you can apply both to the stuff that we're going to work on today, and also, of course, the remainder of the course, which is what you will be tested on when the exam finally does happen. Review sessions, we're already beginning to plan those, and the schedule for that will be coming out real soon. So make sure you tune in for those as well on YouTube. So my name is Mr. Horton, Scott Horton. I teach in Williamsville, New York. It's just outside of Buffalo. If you're familiar with the geography of New York State, we're in Western New York, home of the Buffalo Bills. And today we're going to talk about the Cold War, as I mentioned. So here's the practice question that Ms. Farr left off with yesterday, question about Truman and the atomic bomb. So if you didn't get a chance to do that, to take a second just to read through that and think about why the president is making this statement. So a couple of the possible answers here. I know that you can't respond to me here live, but some of his possible responses are: he cites Germany's attempt to build an atomic bomb. He references Pearl Harbor to remind Americans that Japan attacked us and mistreated our POWs. He also could be sending a message to other countries who might potentially be our enemy, that we're willing to use the atomic bomb, which might be an additional purpose that's not listed on my answer key here. So really, we're going to focus today on the skill of sourcing a document and thinking about the purpose, why someone would write something the way that they did. So quick overview, of course, the Cold War, especially the early Cold War. We're going to talk about many things from Truman's presidency will be the main focus, and then sourcing documents, specifically the purpose of documents, as I mentioned just a second ago. Things you should already know: how America's role in the world changed. So period 7 really covers that change, starting with imperialism as the U.S. begins to reach out to other places around the world by annexing the Philippines and going to war with Spain as a quick example. World War I is in the middle of that topic, where the United States eventually gets drawn into that global war and involves itself, but then removes itself essentially from the world. And then World War II, where the U.S. again takes a leading role in defeating the Axis powers in that war. So really kind of setting up where we are in the Cold War after World War II. We'll talk about that role of the United States in that period. And then sourcing, of course, these are things that you've done before, probably point of view especially, I would guess would be something that you spend a lot of time talking about. So our overriding question: what are the ways America's efforts in the Cold War changed over time, and in what ways did they stay the same? So we're thinking about that CCOT, historical reasoning process, as we go through what we're going to talk about today. And at the end of the lesson, you should understand the variety of ways the U.S. fought the Cold War. There are several answers to that question. So a quick warm-up question, tying into all the things that have been happening in our world in the last 2 or 3 weeks, the COVID war. So one thing to think about with COVID, it obviously is an unprecedented change in our lives and the way we're doing things, including teaching you online on YouTube. Think about what are the things that you fear as a result of COVID. I'll give you about 15 seconds to think about that. If you had to write down the top 3 things that you were afraid of because of COVID. So some answers you might have thought of, some things that might have come to mind. Coronavirus can hurt us or our loved ones. Our lifestyles have had to change in response to COVID. There are many things we can do to try to help end it, but there are also many things that we can't control about it. There are many unknowns, and we don't have similar experience to rely on. None of us have lived through the last time we had a major pandemic, which was after World War I. None of us have that institutional memory. So the reason that I start with that is because you can consider the Cold War to be a very similar thing. It was an unprecedented change in people's lives in that period. What were people afraid of? The Cold War is very much about fear. The Cold War could hurt us or our loved ones, including the threat of nuclear war eventually when the Soviet Union developed nuclear weapons. Our lifestyles had to change in response to the Cold War. There were things we could do to try to end it, but there are many things that we could not control about it. There are many unknowns, and we didn't have similar experience to rely on. We didn't have the threat of global nuclear war that could end life on the planet. So this is something that changed a lot of things for the United States in that period. And the US, of course, is going to take a leading role in that. So a quick definition of the Cold War. The Cold War is a political rivalry between the US and the Soviet Union after World War II. The Soviets, of course, are communist by this point. The US are not communist. They're a capitalist democratic nation. And there's a rivalry for influence between the two of them. Who's going to be really the leader of the world, in a sense, during the period post-1945. It's rooted in fears on both sides. The US feared that the Soviets were trying to expand their influence into Eastern Europe and eventually into other parts of the world. The Soviet Union worried about the United States, as they called it, capitalist encirclement, that they were going to be surrounded by capitalists and ultimately squash through that. And it's fought in a variety of ways. And we're going to look at some examples of documents in just a second here of different ways that this was fought. Collective security is one. Nations banding together to try to stop the possibility of war, to defend themselves against the other side. Economic aid programs from both the US and the Soviet Union. We're going to focus on the US part of that. Diplomacy, signing treaties, for example, between the two sides, trying to calm those fears. Proxy wars is another, which means a war between allies, but not between the US and the Soviet Union. So the reason we call this the Cold War is the US and the Soviet Union never actually engaged in a war against one another. However, they did back allies in other places in the world where communism was fighting non-communism. You'll also notice that the level of tension fluctuates over the course of time, and this is one of the big ideas of the unit that College Board, of course, emphasizes here, that there are times of really high tension between the US and the Soviet Union, and we'll cover a little bit more of those on Monday when I return for that lesson. But then there are times where things seem to ease off a little bit between the two superpowers. And the US is now the most powerful nation on Earth. In 1945, the United States is the only country in the world that has atomic weapons. And the US took a leading role in the world defending our way of life, democracy, and capitalism against what was viewed as the new threat, which of course is the communists. So the purpose of a document, just a quick review of that, the purpose of a document asks you to consider why an author created a document. What were they trying to accomplish? And a lot of times this goes beyond the obvious. And I'll give you an example that I'm sure you've all studied. Gettysburg Address. Lincoln writes the Gettysburg Address as he was invited to come to a cemetery to dedicate that cemetery to the soldiers that had died at the Battle of Gettysburg. So that's a very simple, easy, very literal purpose of that document. But Lincoln takes that to a different level, and Lincoln actually adds some other things here. So you could argue that his purpose was to ask Americans to be dedicated to finishing the war. That the war, of course, was not over at that point, and successfully completing the task that the soldiers had died for at Gettysburg is one of the things that he does in that speech. He also uses the speech to identify the war, really, in a sense, contextualize the war as being consistent with American principles, that this is something that Americans had fought for before, liberty and liberty for all people, and of course extending that to African Americans eventually after the war is over. So there's a lot of answers to the idea of, to the question of what was the purpose of the Gettysburg Address, a very literal one. But then if we think about it a little bit more and delve into it, there's other reasons that Lincoln, of course, writes that speech, that wonderful 2 minutes of American oratory. So let's practice a few. So here is a document, the Truman Doctrine. The context of this is President Truman is concerned about Greece and Turkey are having trouble. They have communist insurgencies in their country, or it's at least viewed that way. And there's some concern about that. So the question I'm going to ask you to think about is two things. What's the point of view of the speech? What was the purpose of the speech? We'll start the timer. So some possible answers for that one. Truman, of course, defines the battle between the two different ways of life, as he calls it, the way of life of free institutions and representative government, and the opposite of that, of course, the will of a minority, which he's really referring to communists there. So the United States fought communism through foreign policy, and so this is an example of what's called the Truman Doctrine, which eventually will become the bedrock of Cold War policy in the United States. Trying to contain or stop the spread of communism is the idea of that. Other presidents eventually will have theirs, as you can see from my list on the screen. So the point of view, America needs to be responsible for helping people's fighting communism, or as he calls them, internal insurgencies. The purpose of the speech explained to Americans why the U.S. is going to take on the role of containing communism. So in a sense, he's trying to set the stage here. You could argue he's setting the stage for increased involvement of the United States in the world post-1945. It's our responsibility to help people fighting communist subversion. Let's try another one. This is a speech by Winston Churchill, who was the Prime Minister of England throughout most of World War II. And the background of this, the context, as you can see on the right-hand side there, World War II ends with the Soviet Union in control of much of Eastern Europe. They had liberated Eastern Europe during World War II, and of course they chose not to go home at that point. They remained in those countries like Czechoslovakia, the eastern part of Germany, Poland, etc. England and the rest of Western Europe were threatened by the increased power of the Soviet Union. And Churchill actually is concerned about this even during the war, that if the Soviets were to liberate Eastern Europe, they might not leave. So this is not something that probably surprised Churchill too much. So I ask you the same two questions again. What's the purpose of the speech? I'm sorry, not the same two questions. What's the purpose? And then think about, he's delivering this speech to an American audience. Does it matter? Would he change what he says here based on who he's talking to? So we'll start the timer. Okay. So another approach to fighting communism was collective security, which is essentially what he's arguing for here, or encouraging. Collective security means working together with other nations to preserve peace. Examples would be things like the United Nations, which is formed at the conclusion of World War II, the formation of NATO, which happens in 1949, where the Western European powers sign a treaty, which is essentially a mutual defense treaty, with the United States involved in that. So what's the purpose of the speech? Convincing Americans to participate in collective security. One of the things that Churchill recognizes here and actually makes an argument about here is that this is a threat to all people that are non-communist, that are non-dictatorship. This is a threat to all free peoples of the world, and he's trying to couch this in terms of everyone needs to be involved. And why does it matter that the speech was delivered to an American audience? Well, the U.S., he thinks, is going to be an important partner, and they ultimately would be an important partner in the effort to stop the spread of communism through the rest of the world. Signing NATO is a great example of that. Eventually, the U.S. does dedicate itself to the defense of Western Europe against the possible threat of the Soviets. Kind of getting into audience there a little bit at the end, and audience and purpose sometimes are very closely related to one another. Another way that the United States fought the war, as I mentioned before, is through proxy wars, aiding non-communist nations against wars against communist nations, and Korea is a great example of that. Vietnam, which we'll get into in a little bit more detail the next time, next Monday, when we revisit that topic, is a really good example of that as well. American forces fighting in countries against communist powers, but not fighting against the Soviet Union. So this is a press release from President Truman about Korea as the Korean War gets started. So let's think about, again, the purpose. What is the purpose of this press release? Let's start the timer now. Okay, so possible answers to this. Truman is justifying why the U.S. is sending our military into Korea. He describes the attack by the North Koreans across the 38th parallel into South Korea. He is explaining that the communists are now using military force in addition to other methods, as he calls them, to spread communism. He also is, of course, explaining what's happening. He's telling the American people about what's going on in Korea. And of course, he's highlighting that it's the communists that are making the attack and that the Americans will be the people being sent in to ultimately defend South Korea. Incidentally, South Korea, of course, is still being defended by the United States. The 8th Army, which was sent into Korea in 1950, remains there. Elements of it remain there to defend South Korea still to this very day, 2020, many years later, of course. So let's try a couple of additional ones just to check to make sure that you understood. So the next document will be a document about the Marshall Plan. And the context of this document is that some European nations were suffering economically because of World War II, and the United States here is going to provide a solution to that. So again, point of view of this speech, what is the purpose of the speech? Okay, let's see what you came up with here. So another approach to fighting communism was providing international aid to non-communist countries, financial aid. An example here is, of course, the Marshall Plan, which he's referring to in the document. The Point Four program is another program where the United States actually gave financial aid to third world nations in an attempt to help them as well, something that is not, of course, referred to in this document. So the point of view of the speech, one of the things he mentions here is that economic instability can lead to political instability. So he is making a connection here between the idea of maintaining peace and maintaining economic stability for people in Europe. Purpose of the speech is, one purpose, of course, is to explain why the U.S. is investing large amounts of money into Europe, why it's important that the United States does that, what ultimately they hope to accomplish with putting a lot of money into Europe, which is maintaining peace in that region of the world and really throughout the planet as a result of Cold War tensions here. All right. So our next document is President Nixon. Now, this is a little bit later in the Cold War, so it's 1973. The war in Vietnam has just wound down. Nixon has gone on two very famous trips to communist nations to try to ease the tensions in the Cold War through a policy he called détente. And so that's the background of this speech that you are going to see here. And so when he talks about the post-war, he's really talking about the post-Vietnam War world here. So again, let's think about the same two questions. What's the point of view of the speech? What's the purpose of the speech? Okay. So the point of view is that the United States is not withdrawing from its role in the world. Of course, he cites the trips to China and to the Soviet Union in this speech. Of course, the United States has not been 100% victorious in the Vietnam War. So he's referencing that as well in the beginning part of the speech here. The purpose of the speech, it's an inaugural address. So of course, it's the beginning of his second term as president, which is a standard practice among presidents. They give this speech to sort of introduce their next term or their first term. So there's lots of purposes here, I think you could argue. One is that he's showing Americans we've not been weakened by Vietnam, that we continue to pursue peaceful policies, for example. He's pointing out the successes of the détente policy, the policy of easing relations between the United States and Soviet Union. As I mentioned before, he makes that very famous trip to China. And eventually also makes a trip to Russia to do the same thing, to sort of ease the relationship between the two nations. He also, a point that you probably wouldn't know without knowing the context of the speech, you could also argue that he's trying to distract Americans from the growing Watergate scandal, which is really beginning to take off at this point. In 1973. So by pointing out foreign policy successes, people might pay a little bit less attention to some of the domestic issues that are going on at home. So that could also be a purpose of the speech, because of course Watergate is not mentioned here. So let's debrief what we've been through here today. So what were some of the ways that America fought the Cold War? So collective security agreements, an example would be NATO that we mentioned a little bit ago. Another example being the United Nations. Diplomacy by making statements like the Truman Doctrine, by signing defensive alliances or treaties like NATO would be another example. International aid, things like the Marshall Plan, which we talked about in one of the documents here, the Point 4 program, which is an economic aid program, and then proxy wars, the Korean War, and of course, Vietnam being referenced here towards the end of that. So there's 4 different answers to that question, different things that the United States did to fight the Cold War. Other examples included things like the space race, the arms race, which we'll talk about a little bit in one of the later sessions, using spying back and forth between the two sides is another way of doing that, encouraging coups against unfriendly governments. So there's lots of different answers here, but we're going to keep it simple to the 4 things that are here. So we started with the question about change and continuity over time. So which of the things are things that changed over time? What are some things that maybe did not change over time? So we'll start with the changes. So initially, America wanted to contain communism in Europe. So when Truman gives the Truman Doctrine, he's talking about Europe, Greece and Turkey specifically. But that commitment to containment eventually spreads to other parts of the world. So Eisenhower, for example, will spread the commitment to contain communism into the Middle East as just a quick example. Fighting in Southeast Asia, in Vietnam, is another example of a growth of that commitment. Stopping the spread of communism in Latin America will be part of that story as well. But then you'll see the second statement I put there after that commitment is the commitment was questioned after the war in Vietnam, and we'll get into that more in one of the later topics. But people begin to question whether or not the United States can, in fact, live up to that commitment to stop communism everywhere in the world. And that will be part of some of the changes that happened in the 1970s when we look at people beginning to wonder about our place in the world and whether or not we can actually fulfill that commitment. America used many different strategies at different times in the Cold War as tensions went up and went down. So I think you could argue here that our policy changed in order to fit or meet the time or the amount of tension. So there are actions that are more militaristic, like the Korean War, where we're actually sending troops into a battle or a fight. The Cuban Missile Crisis, which I'll cover in one of the later segments. The Vietnam War. There are also times when we're trying to create peace with the Soviet Union. So there's a crisis in the Suez Canal in 1956, and Eisenhower actually tries to calm things down. He does not want to, of course, have a war with the Soviet Union. Nixon's policy of détente, which I talked a little bit about with the Nixon document there, the trips to China, the trips to the Soviet Union. And economic aid is another way that the United States tried to do this by helping people in Latin America, people in Europe with financial assistance. The thing that students, at least some of my students, struggle with is what are ways that things did not change? What are ways that things stayed the same? And again, there's several answers for that question as well. American presidents remain committed to limiting the expansion of Soviet influence. So from Truman really through Ronald Reagan, one of the goals that does not change for the United States is the containment or stopping the spread of communism and the influence of the Soviets specifically. The second bullet, America was willing to use limited military actions to limit the spread of communism. Korea is a good example of that. Vietnam is a good example of that. And I use the word limited because, of course, we don't use nuclear weapons. We don't use the full force of American military might, but something less than that. And again, we'll talk more about that in detail with the Vietnam segment when we get there. Americans use their economic power to attempt to influence the Cold War through things like economic aid packages, which we mentioned before. Our economy was at its peak in the period 1945 to 1960, and that will be a topic that I'll cover in a later segment as well. But using that economic power, which actually was something that the Soviets were very afraid of, that the United States economy was so powerful at the conclusion of World War II. And America relied on multilateral collective security arrangements to fight the Cold War. That's something that really doesn't change through much of the Cold War. So we have some things that changed, some things that did not change. And just keep in mind, sometimes the purpose of a document isn't immediately obvious. Don't always go for the literal translation of the document. So we're going to skip ahead here to do a little bit of exam practice. So these are a couple of multiple choice type questions that you might see. You'll recognize the document, I think, pretty quickly here. I'll give you about 30 or 40 seconds to try to answer this question. So this question doesn't really get too much into purpose. It's really asking us to sort of put this into the appropriate place here. So the Iron Curtain speech helped mark the beginning of which of the following developments, and this is one of the beginning phases of the Cold War between the United States and the Soviet Union. B is not the correct answer because the United States does not send troops into Eastern Europe. That probably would have caused World War III, so that doesn't happen. And D, the argument here would be the Soviet Union is not Soviet Union efforts to extend its influence into the countries of Western Europe. It's not the first time that that's really happening. A is the best answer for this one. Same document, different question. Again, we alluded to this one a little bit earlier when we talked about asking you to think about that question about the American audience. Why would he be saying this to an American audience? And so the best answer of the four that are here, participation of both Britain and the US in an international collective security system. He's encouraging the United States to be part of the defense of Western Europe. It's really not about asking the United States to help support Britain's effort to keep its empire. Has nothing to really, he's not talking at all about nuclear weapons being shared here. And they're not referencing Japan certainly at all in the quote here. All right, here's our third question. Okay, so again, the purpose here, the best answer is C, that the purpose is to prompt or encourage the United States to help support democratic nations in Western Europe. Promising financial aid to veterans returning from the Second World War, that does happen, but that's not what Churchill is talking about, and he's certainly not encouraging that. And this is not a quotation, of course, about immigration, and it's not a quotation about labor unions at all. This is a Prime Minister of England encouraging the United States to help the non-communist nations of Western Europe. And the last question. Okay, so the best answer here is A, that Churchill is, of course, highlighting communism as an authoritarian threat. It's a threat to the democratic nations of the world. Certainly B is something that Winston Churchill would have done, but that's not the situation that is really referenced here in the document. He's not worried about communist subversion in the United States. That's something that you'll get into a little bit tomorrow with Ms. Farr when you talk about that. And he's not encouraging us to directly militarily confront the Soviet Union in this. So A is really a good example of the Cold War here. All right. So just a quick public service announcement here. So if you are having trouble, if you know students that are having trouble accessing the internet, there are people that are working on this very hard. It's cb.org/tech. I'll leave this up there just for a second in case you need to take a photo with your phone, or if you want to jot that down here. So if you're struggling with connectivity, or if you know people that are struggling with this, please check that site. You can reach out and help with that. So thank you very much for tuning in today. And we hope you'll join us again each day at 11 o'clock. We're going to be covering different topics, of course, and eventually getting into the question of the reviewing part of the course, which will, of course, be on the exam for you. And that schedule will be posted, as I mentioned at the beginning of the video, sometime very, very soon on that website. So here's a practice question for you to consider for tomorrow's lesson. And the question is, what are the similarities between the Salem witch trials of 1692 and the Red Scare that followed World War I? So tomorrow's lesson will begin with an answer for this question. Hopefully we'll see you then, and hopefully you'll tune in again real soon. Thanks for watching.